anywhere from 25 to 40% of the Scottish economy was tied up in the investments in the Darien scheme, Patterson's Darien scheme. So 25 to 40% is now invested in this idea to create a colony in the middle of all these wars going on around the world on an area that none of them have ever been to, but a real estate guy told him it was really nice. So,
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of WTF History. This is the show where we give two vignettes about crazy moments in history, and you get to determine which one made you say WTF. I am Mike Gatto, and I'm here with my lovely and talented host, David Quintana.
Mike is the smart guy. I'm just kind of like the
You're the looks.
observant guy, the
So,
observer.
so today we have a really fascinating topic, and that is fascinating moments in Scottish history. So my wife is largely of Scottish extraction. I come from a part of Italy where the people they call them testa dura, which means stubborn, hard-headed. And of course, Scots are known for being hard-headed. So it's a pleasant union. Scottish history. We have two vignettes today. One is about a really, really great moment in Scottish history, and one is about a not so great moment in Scottish history. So I thought if it's
Yeah.
okay with you, David, I would start with a positive moment in Scottish history.
Okay. Yeah.
Great.
I'm down.
So this vignette takes us to 1815. And of course, people who are familiar with the key things that date, we are talking June 1815 and the Battle of Waterloo. And most people are aware that, Napoleon was this force of nature for many, many years. He conquered much of Europe. He went into exile. And then in this miraculous scene, he swam or rowed to a passing boat, got transported back to France. As he walked through France, armies and the population came behind him, and he was again menacing Europe. And that's the stage that is set for the Battle of Waterloo. And of course, you have pretty much everybody arrayed against the French. But what people don't understand is that in the Battle of Waterloo, now it's a symbol for like a big defeat, right? But what they don't understand is just how close the French came to winning that battle. During the early part of the day, the forces fighting were really just the French and the United Kingdom, and the French were winning. So that's where we are. Our story comes in, and that is midday during the Battle of Waterloo. So the French had advanced a great deal, and they were putting massive amounts of pressure on the front line. And the British and their allies, the UK, were, or to use an anachronism, the Allied forces were hard pressed everywhere. So then the fateful order came from Major General Ponsonby, and he was the heavy cavalry commander, and he issued this order to the Royal Scots Greys. And the Royal Scots Greys were a dragoon regiment. Well, what does that mean? They were light cavalry. They're designed for speed. The lightest cavalry is what's called hussars, and just a notch above it are dragoons. And what people don't understand, particularly people who watch too many modern TV shows, is that these lighter cavalry regiments were actually designed to go into battle and dismount and then fight. They didn't really fight on their horses all the time. They were like, rather than being like a tank division in the modern world, they were more like a mechanized division. They were designed on their horses, of course, to get where they needed to go fast. And, in many ways fight with their, at this time, pretty light weapons. To be clear, the Royal Scots Greys had no armor. They carried no guns. They just had a long sword and that people call a saber. And at Waterloo, the estimates differ. It's very hard to get good numbers. But at Waterloo, my research indicates that there was about 380 men of them operational. And the order that came from Major General Ponsonby to those 380 men was to charge the French guns. He wanted them to charge in a lightning attack and kill the soldiers who were operating the French cannon and to capture their cannon. And when this order came down and it was read to the men, one of the Royal Scots said really loudly, he was kind of muttering, but everybody heard it. He said, "You want us to charge the French cannon with just our swords in our hands? That would be suicide." And the commanding officer, and this is Lieutenant Colonel Hamilton, he knew that the guys were starting to get a little bit worried. So he just shouted, "Scotland forever!" And the men yelled, "Scotland forever!" And they charged. Now, this scene was immortalized, of course, in the famous painting by the same name. It's called Scotland Forever by Elizabeth Thompson, Lady Butler. And everybody recognizes this painting. And of course, when you look at it, you see the moment that he yells Scotland forever and the moment that these guys charge. Now, a couple things though. If you look closely at the painting, you will see that the horses are at full gallop, which would give this light cavalry regiment a fighting chance when they're charging against cannons and guys shooting at them with muskets and primitive rifles. That piece of the painting is historically inaccurate. The ground at Waterloo was completely waterlogged, and the guys knew it, and that's why the guy made that comment. This regiment, who had one advantage going into battle, which was their speed, was deprived of that for even this mission. They could not gallop. Their horses had to walk. So you imagine giving this really difficult order, essentially a suicide charge, and you're ready to go, and your guys say charge, and then your horse is like click, clop, like stuck in the mud as you
Right.
move forward. And it's got to pull, your horses have to pull their hooves out of thick mud. But the miraculous thing is that the Royal Scots Greys kept going, and they actually got to the French lines, and they captured one of the French's battle standards, and they destroyed many guns. And there was an epic skirmish there. When they got back, a quick count indicated that they had suffered 201 human casualties of their 380, and they had lost 228 horses. We haven't even gotten to the WTF moment yet. Major General Ponsonby, who gave the order, to his credit, this was different back in those days. He actually charged with his men. He led from the front, and he was killed. He was KIA in that charge. Colonel Hamilton, the guy who shut his men down and said, Scotland forever, and led the men into the charge, he was also killed. He was shot through with canister shot from the cannon. And promoted on the field that day was a captain named Edward Cheney. And he was promoted because he was the last officer left of a certain rank. And he had had his horse shot out from under him during the charge. And this guy had slogged forward in the mud on foot, thrashing about with his sword. And, he had fought in the battle, and then he had made it back safely to the Scottish line when they had withdrawn. So now he's in charge of the Royal Scots. They just got badly mauled in this suicidal charge. They lost more than half their numbers. What does he do? He orders a second charge. He goes into the fray again with the remaining men. Again, his horse is shot out from under him. Again, he charges forward on foot. Again, they get a call to fall back, and the Royal Scots fall back and regroup. What does Major Cheney do? He orders a third charge. The guys charge out again. Again, his horse is shot out from under him. Again, he runs up to the front like a madman, jumps into the melee on foot with just his sword. The Royal Scots do whatever they can to the French. They fall back. What does Major Cheney do? He orders a fourth charge, and then a fifth. He had his horse shot out from him 5 times, and he kept coming. The casualty numbers are really hard to come by. But one of the most noted historians on the Battle of Waterloo, a guy by the name of Alessandro Barbero, states that the Royal Scots were wiped out, that they were wiped out. They were completely wiped out. There were obviously some survivors, and Major Cheney was one of them. And it was just an amazing tale of heroism. More amazing because this charge had actually had an effect. It wasn't like the charge of the Light Brigade that really didn't do much. And they actually made the French fall back. And they held them off from being able to fire their cannon and their canister at other swaths of the United Allied armies. And of course, everyone knows what happened later that day. As dusk was approaching, the armies heard the sound of footbeats and drums and pipers blowing their pipes. And they saw this giant dust cloud. And both the French and the English stopped and kind of looked like, is it the French reinforcements? Who's coming? And when the dust cloud cleared, they saw that it was the Germans under Major von Blücher. And of course, that finally stemmed the tide of the battle for the Allies. Now, Edward Cheney has a very, very famous tomb to this day. It's actually in northern England, just south of Scotland. And it depicts him and his 5th horse being shot from him in the Battle of Waterloo. And he's giving comfort to the horse.
Oh.
And the English king wanted to give him this tomb. He wanted to give him the honor being buried in, like, the biggest cathedrals in London. But Edward Cheney declined that. He wanted to be buried in his parish church. And so there's this tiny little parish church where he is buried, and it's got this magnificent equestrian tomb. And every year the town is so grateful. They still have such a good sense of their history that they actually, kids come by and feed the horse statue apples. They put apples in the horse's statue's mouth, and they lay a wreath and flowers on the tomb of Edward Cheney every day, because he was such a brave man. And what he did was really, a prime example of gallantry, and of course, Scottish gallantry, for him to have done this amazing charge. And next time when you and I are in a fight, David, I'm going to say, man, I'm going to come at you like the Royal Scots Greys.
Yeah,
I
like
mean, this should be
Jamie.
like a byword, right? This should be a byword for,
Yeah.
like, I'm not going to give up. And I
Right.
think that's a
Right.
very important lesson.
Yeah, yeah. No, you're right, man. That is a really good story. I didn't know anything about that. One of the things that I take out of that is just one of the things that, as an American, I'm very, very jealous about, and that is how some of these other countries, how much esteem they hold their history in. And regardless of how times change and how things might have been done back then that are very different from today, they understand that at that time, these people and what they did made today possible. And if you go to other countries, you see how much people know their history, respect their history, love their history, and honor their history. And I cannot tell you enough how jealous I am of that. And I wish our country had so much more of that. But I guess, hey, you know
Absolutely.
what? That's why we're on YouTube doing this, I guess.
That's a wonderful point. And it's a wonderful transition to your vignette today. You
Yeah.
told me a little bit about it, and I didn't believe you. And I looked it up, and this fascinates me. And it's a somewhat more less proud moment in Scottish history, but it's one that I don't think anybody knows about.
Yeah, you know what, man? I found out about this because I'm fascinated by the Darien Gap. The Pan American Highway runs from like Alaska all the way down to the tip of Argentina, but there's one place it doesn't touch. That's the Darien Gap. There is a gap in the Pan American Highway, and it's because it is so inhospitable. It has poison insects, it has jaguars, it has poison fish, it has poison plants.
Poison
It
frogs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
poison frogs. On
Yes.
a good day, it has stultifying heat at 99.9% humidity
Oh,
on a good day. And then on other days, it rains like a monsoon. Then it has indigenous people who don't want to see you in their area. If a crop grows in the Darien Gap, it's by accident, right? Never to be replicated. So I did an earlier episode on this when I first started this show. And as I was doing my research for that, I ran across a piece that said, oh, and this is where the Scottish tried to build their colony. And I was like, what, are you kidding me? The Scots tried to put a colony in the most inhospitable place on earth? The dudes from like the Shetland Island,
and
right?
and 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 we should jump in, right? Because there might be people who don't know their history of this little bit. I had to remind myself, Scotland was an independent country for a while, right? I mean,
Correct.
we think of it as it's just an appendage of England, it's part of the UK, but Scotland was an independent nation, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing that people forget is that even England had colonies in Latin America. Belize, for example, they speak English there because it was an English colony.
Yes, I mean, you know what, man? Everybody, their mom had a colony in the as they called them, the Indies, right?
Right.
They were all in there. And Scotland during this period, Scotland had what they call the Seven Ill Years. It was the coldest period of time in 750 years of recorded Scottish history.
Wow.
So this was we're talking about the 1690s, and so crops were failing, people were dying. You know how people talk about the potato famine, in
Sure.
Ireland? This was kind of the equivalent, the Seven Ill Years in Scotland.
Wow.
Scotland was an economic ruin because most of their economy at that time, even though they had the great mercantile power below them in England, they were pretty much, sheep and selling timber. So that's really what Scotland was. Scotland was going through a very, very hard time. And as we know from studying history, really hard times usually generate people with great ideas. And I mean that in every sense of the word. They can literally be great ideas, or they can be like, hey, I got a great idea, which end up selling you down the river.
And this was the
And
latter, right?
yes, and this was one of those. So imagine the most inhospitable place on earth. The Darien area, the Darien coast, the Darien area is on the Isthmus of Panama. It's 80 kilometers in that area from the Pacific Ocean, as a crow flies, from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Only 80 kilometers. It's the area now where the Panama Canal is. So Scotland was like, a lot of people were saying we need to unify with England. We should become one country. We should become one Great Britain. At that time, Scotland and England shared a king, James.
Right.
He was a Stuart. He was descended from Mary, Queen of Scots, right? This was
Right.
Mary, Queen of Scots' great revenge on Queen Elizabeth because Queen Elizabeth couldn't, figure out and have a kid. Mary, Queen of Scots, who she had executed, actually took the throne back with
Yeah.
James, the first James. They shared a king, but they had separate parliaments.
And that is called personal union. It's not a legal union. It's literally the union rests in that person, and it can be broken when that person leaves the throne.
Yes, and it puts them in a weird position, right? Because the Parliament of England and the Parliament of Scotland have very different ideas and agendas and goals. And so this was one of those issues. And so, well, first of all, it was a Stuart, and the Stuart never saw a great opportunity that they couldn't fuck up. I mean, these guys blew twice. They had two chances at creating dynasties, and they blew both of them. So Scotland at this time decides, you know what? We don't need to join with England. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to create the Company of Scotland, right? Like they had the England East India Company, right?
Yep.
So they were going to have the Company of Scotland, and it had a much longer name, right?
I hear
Scotland
there's
at
a
this,
lot of money in them colonies.
yeah,
Right?
right.
Yeah.
Which actually colonies are the worst investment ever if you're a national power. Just
Yeah.
that could be a different show for us. So Scotland decides to create this. Essentially, it's a Scottish India Company, right? Scotland reminds me at this time, Mike, of somebody from the little kids table who decides to go to the
Yes.
adults table and go, "Hey, I got an idea." And the adults look at them and like, "Dude, you don't know how the world works." Because Scotland had this idea, right? Oh, we're just going to go, and start trading. Well, they didn't understand England was at war with France. Spain was a world power. Spain had colonies all over the Atlantic. So now England is like, well, hold it a second. If our little cousin over here, Scotland, goes out and starts trading, pisses off Spain, now Spain is going to come and jump on the side of France. And now we're going to have to fight a unified, you know what I mean? And then they
Right.
had Belgium. Belgium had colonies everywhere. And Belgium is like, dude, now you're infringing on our deal and
Yeah.
we're supporting England. So there were all kind of martial relationships and interactions that were happening at this time that Scotland seemed to be completely unaware of. Again, they came from the kids' table. So they started shopping this around, and England was telling them, dude, that hey, think again. The East India Company was coming to Parliament and going, you can't let these guys get involved in our game. So they start cutting off funding. So in walks a guy named George Patterson. So George Patterson was one of the founders of the Bank of England and a notorious slave trader, but he has had this idea forever because he had been in the Indies and he had been told stories about the Darien coast, and he had seen it from the sea, and he thought, oh, it looks beautiful. Mike, one of my favorite quotes is, I think, by Raymond Chandler from one of his detective potboiler novels.
Right.
And in it, he has this quote, and the quote is, from 30 yards away, she looked like a bombshell. From, from 10 yards away, she looked like she was meant to be viewed from 30 yards away. That's the Darien coast.
Yeah.
So, yeah, when you're at sea and you're looking at it, you see a beach and you see trees, and you're like, oh, that's
Yeah.
beautiful. But when you get up a little closer, you realize, and you spend a little time there, this is not the place to be. So George Patterson had been shopping this idea around for a couple of decades. He had actually tried to sell it to England, and they said, no, it doesn't work for us. I think they were more concerned about Spain. So he went to Scotland because he heard they had created this company. And Mr. Patterson's like, dude, I got this beautiful place. It's on the coast. There's nobody there. Here's another crucial, actually, probably the most crucial mistake they made. At that time, as you know, Spain, essentially, because it was at the Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Pope divided.
Oh yes, yes.
Yeah,
The hemispheres. Yes.
yes. And so Spain had first dibs on all of that area, all
Right.
the way up to like Florida. They had all of that area was theirs, right? And the Portuguese had the other stuff. So so Spain actually had that area. The other thing is Spain had actually tried to colonize that back in the 15, I think 1519, and they had done a little bit of work there. So like 170 years ago, Spain had tried to do something there and it didn't work and they like got out of town. And Patterson read it as, oh, they don't want it instead of like, yeah, it's ours, but it's kind of shitty. So Patterson sold them on this idea, and it actually is a good idea. The idea is, look, that is the smallest piece of land between the Pacific and the Atlantic. We could create a trade route, only 80 miles as the crow flies, and we could become the masters of moving, freight in between the Atlantic and the Pacific, so people don't have to go all the way around the tip of South America. Not a bad idea. And actually, the Panama Railroad and the Panama Canal later, proved that works. But as we all know, how many people died, right, creating both
Sure.
of them. And
Sure.
people still don't live in that area. By the way, the Darien area is still uninhabited. So the people, and he sold them on some. Someone had written some books and describing it. And he sold the Scottish folks on it. They ended up raising 400,000 400,000 sterling. So that's like over 100 million sterling today. So they raised that in 6 months. So everybody was in. Anywhere from 25 to 40% of the Scottish economy was tied up in the investments in the Darian scheme, Patterson's Darian scheme. So 25 to 40% is now invested in this idea to create a colony in the middle of all these wars going on around the world on an area that none of them have ever been to, but a real estate guy told them it was really nice. So, so in July of 1698, 5 ships left from Leith on the east coast of Scotland, and they left there because they wanted to avoid detection by the English.
Yeah, and
Uh,
it's like what you tell a 5-year-old, like, if you have to sneak,
yeah,
it's probably not a good thing. It's probably not something you're proud of, right?
yeah,
Oh,
right,
geez.
right. Not a good start.
Yeah.
So they made landfall on December 2nd, 1698. So it took them like 5 6 months to get there.
Okay.
Honestly, the people who wrote diaries about this said, and the survivors, the few survivors that there were, they said that the trip there was actually the worst part.
Jeez.
It was worse than the malaria. It was worse than the starvation. It was worse than the Spanish shooting at them. It was the trip was the worst part. But
Oh, that's funny.
yeah, so they created a colony called Caledonia. And in Caledonia, again, they went about to try and grow crops. They could not grow crops. They went and they dug a ditch, and I hear that's the only thing surviving. So I hear that is the only thing surviving. If you go to that area today, it's the only thing. There's like remnants of a ditch that they dug. They began dying. I mean, you can imagine what it was. It was steaming jungle heat. They could not grow crops. The other thing is that the Spanish, the Belgian, the English told all traders not to buy anything because part of their other trade
Oh,
was, people who are working their way down the coast to go down the the tip of South America. Their idea was to sell them things, right? Sell them some trinkets or whatever as they're passing by. Well, the Spanish, the Belgian, the French, and the English all told them do not buy from them.
oh,
So they cut them off. All of those same countries told people not to resupply them. So they had been completely cut off, right, by their own countries. England, right? They shared a king, but the English Parliament, again, because they're not unified, said no, do not sell to these guys. They
that's
need to leave.
brutal.
So at a certain point, they were losing up to 10 people a day, 10 Scots. You know what's funny is like, have you ever seen a Scottish person after they spend one day on the beach, right?
Yes.
Kind of look like a tomato, right?
Yeah.
And I feel bad for them. I mean, they're growing up
Right.
in freaking Scotland, right?
Yeah.
And I can imagine 1,200 Scots on the coast of Panama, right?
And again, it's worth saying because there might be people who don't know. This is at the equator.
Yeah,
It's pretty much 0 degrees, 5 degrees, something like that, around there.
yeah,
Number two, it's 99 degrees with 99% humidity, and it's before sunscreen. So, like, if you're like, oh my god, it's really hot from digging this ditch, you really can't take off your clothes.
yeah,
You need to wear your
right.
clothes as sunblock, right? So you're just sweating all day long in this miserable existence.
Yeah, and they couldn't grow crops. The food that they had on the ships was now worm infested because the food wasn't ready for a climate like that. They couldn't sell trinkets to ships passing by because the Spanish, the English, and the Belgian and the French had all told them do not buy from them. So in July 1699, they pulled up stakes. There were about 300 of the original 1,200 that survived. So just an amazing body count. Whoever was left, they just left, and Caledonia was in a ruin. But because we didn't have, communications then, no one had told Scotland that,
Huh.
hey, 10 people a day are dying here. There's no food, there's no shelter, and they're sweating and burning to death. So they had sent more ships with 1,000 more people,
Oh
and
no.
so those people then arrived, right? They arrived in at the colony in on the Darien coast. So by now the Spanish had gotten around and say, hey, there's people down there. So now the Spanish army was coming down. So now they had the weather, they had the bugs, they had the fish, they had the animals, they had the lack of shelter, the lack of food, and the Spanish army.
Jeez.
So the Spanish army besieged them. There were some battles. Actually, the Scots kind of held their own in a couple battles. We don't need to get into that. But after having laid siege to the fort there on the coast, the Spaniards, who also were not having the greatest time down there, by the way, it is the Darien Gap. So they were like, hey, you know what? If you guys just want to call it a day, we'll let you keep your shit and just go. And so they did. At the end of the day, I think only a handful of the original 1,000 people that came down in the second group made it back due to the warfare, the starvation, the deprivation, and the disease. So that is how it ended, right? So that was the one of the most failed colony attempts I've ever heard. It lasted from 1698 to 1699. A bunch of Scotch tourists, right, with fanny packs coming down to the coast of Panama.
And David, I'm shocked, like shocked to learn that like oats don't grow in Panama. You know, like,
Right, right,
I mean,
right. I'm just glad he didn't bring like sheep or
oh my God.
those hairy coup and try to
Right.
create hairy coup ranches down there.
Oh my God.
So what happened after this? Well, as we said, anywhere from a quarter to 40% of the Scottish economy was tied up, right,
Mm.
in this venture, this scheme. George Patterson, by the way, he got a small percentage of all the money raised and then a small percentage of any profits that came from the colony. He eventually was found to be kind of an embezzler, and he had a bunch of. He was on the outs pretty quickly. The guy whose entire idea was it was a great vision, by the way. It really was not that way, but for the canal. He was on the outs. He ended up going there. He survived. He went to New York. He was kind of shunned. His wife died on the trip there, so that's what happened to him. Um, what happened though is that now after this, they were really, really in bad. They were in much worse condition than they were during the 7 ill years of the 1690s. Now their entire economy was in shambles. The people that came back were shunned and hated because people had lost a lot of money, including a lot of the upper tier of Scottish society at that time. And so now the calls for unification with Great Britain, with England, became even greater. And so that many people believe led to the Union, right,
The
where
Acts
we
of
get Great
Union, yeah.
Britain. Yeah,
1707, right? Yeah.
in 1707, the Acts of Union, because England agreed to pay off the debts of that
Wow.
Scotland and actually that many of the investors had incurred.
Oh.
So at the end of the day, it was the investors who had their money returned,
So,
and
so,
all they
so,
did.
I mean, and just like today, right? Like you have a society where there's a ruling class.
Yep,
They have a financial, stake in the outcome of a governmental decision. And I'm sure they hired whatever a lobbyist was called in 1707, and they told the parliament, "Hey, listen, we want our money back. We've got 128 million dollars in this venture. We want it
yeah.
back."
And so the amount that England eventually moved over to England, agreed to cover, right, for Scotland, was almost exactly the amount that level of upper tier investors had put into the scheme. So,
Wow.
like you said, this is one of the great lessons out of this. It's that those people at the top who created this entire freaking mess, one of the worst colonial ventures that you could even imagine, they got their money back.
Ugh,
And Scotland, all they did was lose their sovereignty.
they lost their independence, which Scots are. I mean, and what's so fascinating about this, David, and why I love this story is because this is still relevant today. You have Scotland talking about declaring their independence again and asserting their Scottish identity. And you can kind of understand how they feel, besides all the other stuff, Bonnie Prince Charlie and all that stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but they can kind of feel how it was stolen by some mismanagement by some people
Yeah.
at the top.
What is it? Robert Burns has a poem, and I'm going to do it. I won't do it justice, but I think the last lines of it, and they sold their soul for British gold. Nah, I'll mess it up for English
Yeah.
gold. I'm messing it up entirely. But anyway, it is not something that was lost on the poets and the writers of Scotland as they move forward after 1707, which was how the soul of Scotland was sold, right?
Yeah.
So that these people could make their money back. And that was my story. Man, this was a good episode. I really appreciated this, Mike.
And Scots or people out there who just like this, we want to hear from you. Tell us what we missed, and if you want to make some haggis, I'll send it my way.
You're on your own. All right, man. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Hey, if you like what you hear, like and subscribe. It really means a lot, and we would love to have you coming back every week. Thank you.